In the grand lineage of Final Fantasy, there are moments of greatness, milestones that reshape the genre, defined entire generations of players, and elevated video games into high art. And then there's Final Fantasy XIII-2, a sequel to a game that already left fans divided, confused, and in many cases actively disillusioned. A sequel that few asked for, fewer understood, and almost no one expected to continue a story that hadn't been told so much as mumbled through a corridor. Final Fantasy XIII was and remains one of the most controversial entries in the series' history. Its infamous linearity, tangled lore, and emotionally distant characters left players wondering, what happened to Final Fantasy? So naturally, rather than retreating from this narrative misstep, Square Enix decided to double down, and in doing so, they didn't just continue the chaos, they amplified it. They cracked open a Pandora's box of paradoxes, alternate timelines, and metaphysical nonsense so dizzying that Kingdom Hearts began to look like a carefully curated museum exhibit. So with all of that said, join me today as we begin to look at a title where logic takes a backseat to spectacle, and consequences bend to the whims of alternate timelines. This isn't just a story of a sequel gone awry, it's a story of a corporate panic, of narrative overcompensation, and a studio so desperate to salvage its insanely expensive new mythology that it forgot what made Final Fantasy special in the first place. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is Final Fantasy XIII-2, the confusing sequel no one asked for. Yeah! Now, while the Final Fantasy XIII era was undeniably a polarising time for fans of turn-based RPGs, a period where spectacle often trumped substance and plot twists were fired off like confetti at a New Year's rave, it's worth remembering that the genre didn't die, it simply mutated. And today we're finally seeing a resurgence, case in point, Expedition 33, a modern turn-based gem that proves stylish combat and smart storytelling can coexist without drowning in pseudo-philosophical nonsense or being narrated by a floating plush toy. Best of all, use my link to get a ludicrous 41% off this breakout hit, as well as huge money off thousands of other games including practically every Final Fantasy game ever released. Happy shopping, save some massive amounts of money, and hope you enjoyed this video. Previously on here, I broke down exactly why Final Fantasy XIII remains one of the most divisive entries in the series, from its ultra-linear design and delayed combat depth to its polarising cast and world building. But despite all of that, I'll be honest, I still liked it. Flawed, absolutely, but there's something about its atmosphere, visuals, and unapologetically weird lore that kept me hooked, even if it took 20 hours to really get going. But I can certainly see why it wasn't for everyone, and while I enjoyed the ride, I didn't come away feeling particularly hungry for a follow-up. Still, that didn't stop Square Enix from providing us with exactly that. So, what was going on that compelled them to make a direct sequel to one of the most divisive games that the company had ever published? The fallout from Final Fantasy XIII wasn't just a public relations headache, it was an internal reckoning. The game's troubled development, plagued by Square Enix's decision to simultaneously build a brand new engine, the now infamous Crystal tools, alongside the game itself, had turned what should have been a smooth production into an expensive, chaotic mess. The kind of mess that makes board members twitch and shareholders nervous. So holding these thoughts, why exactly did Square Enix decide to make a sequel to Final Fantasy XIII? A game that, while graphically stunning, left the fanbase more emotionally distant than a brooding cloud clone on a foggy day. Simple: money, momentum, and mythology. You see, Final Fantasy XIII may have fractured the fandom, but it still moved millions of copies. Over 7 million in fact. A commercial juggernaut that gave Square Enix something far more valuable than critical praise: justification. The money invested alone made it far too expensive to abandon after just one release, so rather than start from scratch, Square opted to spit in their high-stakes gamble and make another Final Fantasy XIII game. The potential for asset reuse, engine retooling, and a creative team who still believed there was gold buried under all that dense lore, that was all the encouragement they needed. But there was another reason too, one far more insidious. As mentioned on here previously, Final Fantasy XIII wasn't just a game, it was part of a grand, sprawling mythos known as Fabula Nova Crystallis, the pretentious name for what amounted to let's try to Marvel Cinematic Universe this thing, but with more crystals and fewer coherent timelines. After the release of the perplexing to some Final Fantasy XIII, director Motomu Toriyama wasn't done. He had more to say, and if the audience didn't quite understand the first game, well, clearly the solution was to throw in time travel, paradoxes, and alternate dimensions. That'd clear things up. So rather than course correct, Square Enix chose to escalate. They didn't just stick to their guns, they polished them, reloaded them, and aimed them squarely at the player's already fragile understanding of the plot. Thus, Final Fantasy XIII-2 was born, not out of fan demand, but out of creative stubbornness, financial necessity, and a deep corporate desire to make lightning strike twice. Development on Final Fantasy XIII-2 kicked off around March or April of 2010, a mere few months after the original game had divided the fanbase like a mithril axe through butter. This wasn't a fresh start, this was a high-stakes salvage mission, orchestrated by the same shadowy cabal responsible for Dissidia, Kingdom Hearts, and the entire Fabula Nova Crystallis tangled mess. The names at the helm, all too familiar. Motomu Toriyama returned as director despite being the man many blamed for 13's indecipherable narrative. Yoshinori Katase remained on board as producer. Tetsuya Nomura was back sketching out more buckles than belts, and Osamu Kamiko Kukurio, which is really hard to say, once again took charge of the game's surreal dreamlike landscapes. If you were hoping for a full-on creative shake-up, this certainly wasn't it. However, there were some notable internal production changes. After the bruising fan reception to Final Fantasy XIII, it became clear, even to Square Enix, that at least something had to give. The critics had been merciless at times, fans were exhausted, and behind the scenes the developers were quietly nursing battle scars from one of the most convoluted production cycles in the company's history. So for XIII-2, Square Enix decided to try something radical. They asked for outside help. Not from the fans, of course, don't be silly, from Eidos, the company's European subsidiary and the studio best known for Tomb Raider, Hitman, and understanding what a development schedule actually is. Eidos offered something rarely seen in the hallowed halls of Square Enix: structure, a Western production philosophy based on things like milestones, deadlines, and accountability. Revolutionary concepts, clearly. As a result, XIII-2 became one of the first Final Fantasy games to follow a rigid monthly development schedule, a move that probably sent shockwaves through the artistic free-for-all that had birthed XIII's crystal-infused corridor simulator. And the changes didn't stop there. Rather than keeping everything in-house as before, Square Enix enlisted Tri-Ace, the veteran Japanese RPG studio behind Star Ocean and Valkyrie Profile, to lend their talents in art, game design and programming. Not as a panicked outsourcing scramble, but a carefully coordinated plan to keep internal staff numbers low and workflow efficient. A strategy that would have sounded downright heretical just a few years prior. The goal was clear: rein in the chaos. Frequent test builds were played, concept videos were circulated, and everything, for once, was built around a consistent vision. The result wasn't exactly streamlined, but it was at least organised, which in Square Enix terms was nothing short of miraculous. But above all, the team knew they had to respond. 13 had been lambasted for its linearity, sterile environments, and complete lack of distractions. No NPCs to talk to, very few side quests to explore, and not even a decent minigame to waste your gil on. So XIII-2 aimed to be an apology tour, bringing with it some radical reform. Out went the single corridor, in came the complete opposite, a time-jumping map system known as the Historia Crux. NPCs now offered side quests, and towns were finally explorable. Artists were encouraged to inject personal flair, resulting in spaces that, for the first time in years, actually felt like someone lived there. And in a move that raised more than a few eyebrows, the team even cited Red Dead Redemption. Yes, the gritty cowboy sandbox as a key inspiration for XIII-2, as well as open world structures go anyway. Because when you're trying to recover from a sci-fi disaster about time-warping god crystals, why not look to the Wild West? Well, we can laugh, but it worked for Star Wars, I guess. Whether these changes represented real progress or just carefully arranged window dressing, that's another question entirely. What we can say for certain is that Final Fantasy XIII-2 looked very different on paper. The developers had promised more freedom, more choices, and more reasons to actually engage with the world around them. But promises are easy, executing is another matter. The game was unveiled in dramatic fashion at the Square Enix first production department premiere in Tokyo in January 2011. A glitzy showcase designed to distract from the elephant in the room, that no one had asked for this. But by December 15th that same year, the game was already on store shelves, the result of a lightning-fast development cycle of just 18 months. Fast, frantic, and fueled by pressure, this was a sequel born not of vision, but of necessity. Entire environments are recycled, animations repurposed, and assets flip like burgers at a midnight rush. Something had to justify all that time and money spent on crystal tools, so maybe this was the answer. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Story-wise, the game picks up 3 years after the events of Final Fantasy XIII, the game where a group of 6 ordinary people were forcibly transformed into the sea, unwilling servants of godlike beings known as the Fal'Cie. Their task or focus was to help trigger the end of the world by crashing the floating sphere of Cocoon, essentially an orbital utopia, down onto the surface of a wild and untamed Grand Pulse. It was convoluted, but if you made the effort to get into it, it all kind of made sense. At the 11th hour, catastrophe was averted. 2 of the party members turned themselves into giant crystal pillars, suspending Cocoon mid-fall like some sort of divine scaffolding, preserving the world but at a great cost. It was surreal, it was dramatic, and crucially, it was a fitting conclusion. The world was saved, the threat was over, the story, for all its tangled wires, had reached a natural stopping point. We didn't need a sequel, but we got one anyway, and this time, time itself would become the enemy. Fast forward to 13-2 and the world is still reeling. With Cocoon's government and the Sanctum in ruins, most of its population have been forced down to the surface of Grand Pulse. A new order rises from the ashes, a technocratic institution known as the Academy, part scientific think tank, part government, and entirely not suspicious at all. But here's where things get messy. As already alluded to loads in this video, this isn't just a sequel, it's a time-travelling sequel. Much of the game unfolds in the year 3 AF. That's after the fall, naturally, but you'll be ping-ponging between multiple time periods, alternate realities, and twisted versions of the same locations via a mysterious nexus called the Historia Crux. Yes, really. From the wilds of Grand Pulse to the fractured remnants of Cocoon, and even to surreal realms like the Void Beyond, a liminal space between timelines. The game's setting is less a world and more a kaleidoscope of broken clocks. And at the centre of it all, Valhalla, the capital of the goddess Etro, located quite literally at the end of time. Here the goddess stands vigil, holding back a destructive force known as Chaos, the dark energy threatening to consume all of existence and unravel the timeline itself. In other words, if you made the effort to wrap your head around the convoluted lore of Final Fantasy XIII, forget everything you knew, because from this point forward in the tale, the already bloated and self-indulgent story becomes entangled in a cosmic spasm wrapped in feathers and paradoxes, where time is broken, reality is subjective, and your mission is to somehow fix a universe that's already halfway gone. It's quite fitting, really. For a sequel that never needed to exist, Final Fantasy XIII-2 goes out of its way to unravel everything that 13 spent 60 hours painfully trying to resolve. The world was saved, the arc complete, but here we are, spiraling through fractured timelines, chasing forgotten gods and lost relatives, while reality itself buckles under the weight of Square Enix's metaphysical fanfiction. And even more crazily, we haven't even met the villain yet. Because yes, dear viewers, there is a villain. One who makes Sephiroth look restrained and Kuja seem emotionally stable. A man with anime hair, a glowing book, and an obsession with fate, death, and a girl who keeps dying over and over again. But we'll get to him soon enough. Now you might be wondering, if this is a sequel to Final Fantasy XIII, where's Lightning? Well, that's a very good question, because rather than continuing as the central protagonist, Lightning, the face of the original game, the pink-haired warrior turned fashion model, has now been relegated to a supporting role. She appears sporadically, tucked away in cutscenes, drifting through the void and acting as the game's cryptic narrator, a ghost in her own sequel. Instead, the reins are handed to her younger sister, Sarah Farron, a school teacher turned time traveller who spent most of the last game encased in crystal, and joining her, a brooding acrobatic mystery man named Noel Chryse, who claims to be from a desolate future where he's the last human alive, naturally. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd call Noel Chryse the absolute pinnacle of masculinity, peak man, the textbook definition of a rugged hero, if that textbook was published by Teen Beat magazine in 2003. With his blue metrosexual shirt, flawless cheekbones, and enough necklace to open a Claire's Accessories franchise, Noel doesn't exactly scream last surviving human warrior. As mentioned earlier, our journey begins in the year 3 AF. Where Sarah Farron now lives a relatively peaceful life in a settlement on Grand Pulse. She is rudely interrupted by a sudden monster invasion, because of course she is. These aren't your garden variety beasts either, they're quite literally being displaced from time, a clear sign that reality is already starting to buckle. Then appears Noel Chryse, part gladiator, part cryptic expedition dump, and apparently a time traveller from the year 700 AF. He appears out of nowhere to help fend off the attack, claiming he met Lightning in a dreamlike realm known as Valhalla and insists she's very much alive, just inconveniently erased erased from history. Why? Because when she was pulled into Valhalla to serve the goddess Etro, her presence in the events following the fall of Cocoon was erased entirely. Everyone forgot she was ever there. Everyone except Sarah. Now, if all of that already sounds like a fever dream held together with duct tape and anime tropes, hold on tight because we're only just getting started. You see, Final Fantasy XIII isn't content with simply being a time travel story. No, that would be far too straightforward. Instead, it insists on layering multiple alternate timelines, dozens of temporal anomalies, branching realities, and a metaphysical war involving immortal seeresses, a goddess on the brink of death, and an antagonist who seems to exist simultaneously in every era with no explanation beyond just go with it. And while you're hurtling through centuries with no consistent point of reference, the game gleefully tosses out terms like artifact, gate seal, chaos infusion, and paradox scope with such frequency that it starts to feel less like you're playing an RPG and more like you've walked into an underfunded Doctor Who spin-off written entirely in cutscenes. The central concept, fixing time, sounds clean on paper, but in practice it means jumping from one disconnected scene to the next, in eras marked by arbitrary numbers and vague exposition, as characters stumble across long-dead civilizations that somehow remember events from futures that technically haven't happened yet. It's not just convoluted, it's chronologically spiteful, and yet somehow it gets even messier when we start talking about the gameplay, which we shall discuss in a moment. Originally, director Motomu Toriyama initially imagined a story set 900 years after the events of 13, a distant, disconnected future that might have allowed the devs to start fresh without tripping over their own lore. But as they fleshed out the centuries in between, they made the fateful decision to collapse it all into a single narrative, and thus the time travel plotline was born, because nothing says clear storytelling like 1,000 years of exposition shoved into a 40-hour RPG. He also wanted to give Sarah her moment in the spotlight, since she spent the last game trapped in a crystal while everyone else did the heavy lifting. Fair enough. Lead writer Daisuke Watanabe was brought back to figure out how any of this could possibly make sense, and to assist the lore wrangling, Square Enix brought in Emi Nagashima, better known by her pen name Jun Ishima, who had previously penned tie-in novellas for Final Fantasy XIII, because when your main storyline starts sounding like rejected fanfiction, it helps to consult the author of the official ones. Structurally, the story was chopped into smaller narrative chunks, pieces of drama, as they called them, echoing the format of a television series rather than a traditional RPG. Internally, the working title wasn't even 13-2, it was Final Fantasy XIII Season 2, because nothing says high fantasy quite like an accidental Netflix pitch. Tonally, the team wanted a darker, more mysterious vibe. In fact, the original plan had Sarah travelling alone with her flying plush toy companion Mog, but when early dialogue tests revealed the pairing sounded like, and I quote, too girly, almost camp, the decision was made to introduce Noel Christ, to inject a bit of brooding edge and balance for sugar content. Even with Noel in the mix, Watanabe admitted the two-character dynamic was challenging to write, with no ensemble cast to bounce off. Every conversation had to carry emotional weight, character development and plot momentum without becoming repetitive or worse, unintentionally comedic. And perhaps most tellingly, the script deliberately distanced itself from the dense mythology of 13. Words like l'Cie and fal'Cie, once thrown around with reckless abandon, were now politely swept under the rug, deemed too difficult to understand. Because when even the writers admit the lore has become a liability, that's probably a red flag. What is also amusing is that there was even plans to link 13-2 more directly to Final Fantasy Type 0 via the shared location of Valhalla. But like so many things in this tangled universe, that thread was eventually cut, perhaps for the best. While Noel and Sarah are our only two main playable protagonists, we can't talk about 13-2 without at least mentioning the rest of the cast. Let's start with the big bad, Caius Ballard. Because when your game's already juggling multiple timelines and cosmetic deities, why not throw in a brooding immortal in a cape who sounds like he's been gargling gravel since the fall of Atlantis? Caius isn't your typical villain. No, he's a literary villain. He quotes poetry, he monologues like a man auditioning for Hamlet, and he carries around a glowing purple book, the Book of Prophecies, naturally, which contains all the tragic fates of a girl named Yule, who is constantly reborn and constantly dying over and over again forever. This apparently is Caius' tragic burden. He spent centuries watching Yule die from overusing her magic crystal eyes, and it's given him a case of chronic villainy. So his solution? Tear down the timeline, destroy the goddess Etro, collapse reality itself. Honestly, it's a bit much, but in fairness, if I had to sit through every version of Final Fantasy XIII's plot on loop, I'd probably want to erase time too. Then there's Yule herself, who appears in at least 6 versions, all identical, all sad, all doomed. Her main job is to stand around, whisper cryptic warnings, and keel over dramatically whenever the plot demands it. She's less a character and more an interactive metaphor with fringe. Meanwhile, the original cast of Final Fantasy XIII, the actual stars of the last game, have been regretfully downgraded to support roles, or as I like to call them, the cutscene cameo squad. Take Snow Villiers, for example, the man once positioned as the series' brash, punch-first, think-never hero, who now spends most of the game turning up brooding and disappearing again like someone who's late for his own DLC. What's baffling though is how Snow, the man who spent the entirety of Final Fantasy XIII shouting about love, punching demigods in the name of Sarah, and proposing marriage mid-apocalypse, now behaves like the emotionally detached ex-boyfriend of someone he barely remembers. You'd think after all that melodramatic bluster and crystallized heartbreak he'd be clinging to Sarah like a lost puppy, but no, in 13.2 he shows up occasionally to mumble vague reassurances, then sods off again with all the warmth and romantic energy of a postman delivering bad news. It's almost impressive how quickly they managed to drain every ounce of affection from what was once the emotional core of the previous game. He's less a fiancé now and more of a wandering side quest. Yes, technically he's off looking for lightning, supposedly to make Sarah happy. Noble in theory, absolutely idiotic in execution. Because rather than say, being with his actual fiancée, the woman he spent an entire game trying to save, he's now gallivanting through paradoxes like a budget time-travelling vigilante, leaving Sarah to clean up the mess with a Moogle and a man she's just met. It's the romantic equivalent of forgetting your anniversary because you was too busy building a shrine to your sister-in-law. Snow talks about love with the sincerity of a bad soap opera monologue, but when it actually comes to showing up for Sarah, he vanishes into the time stream like a moody side character who forgot what game he's in. Hope Estai meanwhile has gone from teen angst incarnate to full-on child prodigy. Now inexplicably running the Academy, a technocratic institution that's somehow both the world's government and a science fair, Hope dishes out exposition like it's going out of fashion, all while pretending he didn't once scream his way through a corridor for 40 hours. Once a whiny but recognisable human kid, Hope has now become a sterile, technocratic exposition machine, less of a character, more of a clipboard with legs. As for Sazh Katzroy, he was one of the most genuinely likeable characters in Final Fantasy XIII. He had heart, he had depth, he had a chocobo living in his hair for crying out loud. Amidst all the brooding and melodrama, he was the emotional anchor, a single dad with real stakes, real motivation, and actual personality. And how did Square Enix reward him for being the most grounded human presence in the entire cast? By locking his only meaningful content behind DLC, then relegating him to a casino subplot so flimsy it could have been written on a napkin during lunch. In fact, and I say this with a growing sense of existential dread, as I was writing this very script, a horrifying realization struck me like a chocobo to the face. The Star Wars sequels trilogy may have ripped off Final Fantasy XIII almost beat for beat. Think about it. In the first installment, we're introduced to a grounded, relatable black man, scared, conflicted, and very human, trying to survive in a universe gone mad. In Final Fantasy XIII, it's Sazh, a grieving father, navigating an incomprehensible metaphysical nightmare with only a chocobo chick and a slowly unraveling sense of hope. In The Force Awakens, it's Finn, a traumatized stormtrooper desperate to escape the war machine he was born into. Both men are the emotional hearts of their stories, the anchors to the audience. Both provide much needed levity and a very real sense of vulnerability amidst all the melodrama and magic. And then, the sequels happened. In Final Fantasy XIII-2, Sazh is quite literally banished to DLC, showing up in a garish casino side quest full of meaningless minigames, lame comic relief, and a storyline so inconsequential it might as well have been a mobile tie-in. In The Last Jedi, Finn is sent out on a detour to Canto Bight, a cartoonish casino planet where the political subtext is spoon-fed like it's aimed at toddlers, and the entire subplot feels like it was written by someone who lost a bet. And here's where things get even more disturbingly familiar. Both Lightning and Ray are written to appear stronger by undercutting the mouths around them. It's not strength through development, it's strength through contrast. Lightning treats Sazh like deadweight, barely tolerating his presence. Ray constantly drags Finn around, mocks his hesitation, and makes him look like comic relief while she masters everything instantly. Their vulnerability, once compelling, becomes the punchline, a cheap way to prop up the heroine without actually building up her character. What begins as stories about two men's survival, grief and redemption becomes surreal sideshow acts. Did someone discover a secret bad writing technique? A sort of cursed narrative blueprint labelled how to dismantle your most relatable character in 3 easy steps? Because the more you look at it, the more these two trilogies, Final Fantasy XIII and the Star Wars sequels, start to mirror each other, like some grim parallel universe of mixed potential. An opening act with genuine promise followed by a second chapter that tosses character arcs into the sea in favour of false lore, tonal whiplash and unnecessary casino detours. Coincidence? Maybe, but perhaps there's a deeper truth at work here, and frankly, the resemblance is starting to freak me out. As for Fang and Vanille, they are technically still around, and by around, I mean they've been turned into glorified furniture. That's not hyperbole, they spent the entire game frozen in crystal, quite literally holding up Cocoon like two mythological bookends. The lore frames it as some noble sacrifice, a testament to their heroism and devotion. But let's be honest, it feels more like Square Enix had no idea what to do with them, so they quietly shoved them into decorative purgatory and hoped no one would ask questions. They're not characters anymore, they're props, but I suppose at least that fate is better than what they had in store for Sazh. Mechanically speaking, Final Fantasy XIII-2 is a role-playing game, at least on paper. Much like its predecessor, you control your characters in third person, meandering around oversized environments, talking to NPCs, poking shiny objects and occasionally triggering battles with time-dispatched monstrosities. It's all very familiar, until the game proudly unveils its piece de resistance, the Historia Crux. A glorified time-travelling level select menu that looks like someone tried to build a conspiracy board in PowerPoint. You'll visit places like Erba in both 200 AF and 400 AF, because apparently nothing says epic adventure like backtracking through different versions of the same map. Some areas even have multiple versions within the same year, because linear storytelling is for cowards. And yes, you'll be riding a chocobo. Of course you will, it's Final Fantasy. Though navigating the shattered remnants of space-time on the back of a giant chicken does rather undercut the urgency of saving the timeline. Revisiting past areas is encouraged, nay required, thanks to seals, items that allow you to reset a timeline, so you can replay a region and make different choices. Because of course this game lets you go back in time to undo things, you know, in case the story wasn't tangled enough already. The game auto-saves now, finally, and you can manually save at any time, a rare mercy from the developers. And rather than buying your potions from a glowing orb like in Final Fantasy XIII, you'll now purchase goods from Chocolina, a time-travelling bikini merchant with the energy of a children's TV presenter and the wardrobe of a fashion-forward fever dream.
But this is a place of dreams, a place where anything can happen.
Dialogue is handled through something called the live trigger system, which lets you choose from multiple responses when talking to NPCs. These choices usually change absolutely nothing, but they do at least offer you the illusion of agency. And isn't that what Final Fantasy XIII-2 is all about? Oh, and every now and then the game throws you into temporal rifts. Mandatory puzzle sections that grind the pace to a halt, usually just as the story was beginning to resemble coherence. Because if there's one thing this game loves, it's adding extra systems no one asked for, wrapped in lore nobody understands. Combat in Final Fantasy XIII-2, for better or worse, is nearly identical to its predecessor, a rehash of the active time battle system now rebranded with the vaguely corporate sounding name Command Synergy Battle, because nothing screams epic fantasy like terminology borrowed from a business strategy presentation. You've got your ATB gauge, your attack queues, your standard menu commands like attack abilities and items all slotted into a bar that slowly fills up like a very polite kettle. You can either wait for it to fill before unleashing a barrage of moves, or spam through with whatever's charged like a panicked intern at a spellcasting seminar. The big innovation? You can still press auto battle and let the game do the thinking for you, a mechanic that helpfully reminds you just how far we've come from the days of strategy over spectacle. Characters hurl around magic, smack things with swords, and perform healing actions that basically make death a temporary inconvenience. In true Final Fantasy XIII fashion, your party's health fully regenerates after every fight, removing any real sense of long-term consequence. It's like tactical combat with the training wheels bolted on. Monsters now appear randomly while exploring, popping out of nowhere with a countdown timer that screams, "Quick, pretend you're interested." If you manage to ambush them before the clock runs out, you get a preemptive bonus. If not, they just slap you into the next battle screen, where all your strategic hope goes to die. And here's where things get especially ridiculous. Your third party member isn't a character, it's a monster. Yes, instead of having a full party of developed personalities, you're now catching and deploying creatures like it's Final Fantasy Time Travel Pokemon Edition. Over 150 monsters can be captured from battle, and they each have unique skills and a special move called a Feral Link, which is activated through quick time events because Square Enix apparently couldn't resist throwing in some Twitch-based fluff. You can swap between controlling Sarah and Noel mid-fight, but the other human and your pet monster are left in care of the game's AI, which has a long and proud tradition of doing exactly the opposite of what you want it to. Still, at least they're enthusiastic. In theory, this system offers depth. In practice, it's a lot of menu mashing, auto-battling, and watching your newly recruited Flan or Wolf do backflips while you wonder if you accidentally downloaded someone's fan mod. But hey, it's dynamic, it's stylish, and it's technically functional. Just don't expect it to feel like a party-based RPG unless your idea of a party is a girl, a guy, and a sentient cactus. To manage all of this chaos, just like in the previous entry, you'll need to master the Paradigm system, a combat mechanic that lets you swap between pre-assigned roles mid-battle. You get 6 again: Commando, punch things hard; Ravager, light them on fire; Medic, stop the bleeding; Saboteur, debuffs; Synergists, buffs; and Sentinel, meat shield. You set up combinations of these roles in advance, known as paradigms, and flip between them during combat to suit the situation. Monsters, as you may recall, make up your third party member, and they don't get to multi-class like the humans do. Each one comes with a single fixed role. You can equip up to 3 different monsters per paradigm deck, swapping them out as needed. Leveling is handled through the Crystarium, back again and just as irritating as before, though this time it looks like a constellation someone scribbled on a pub napkin. Each character has their own Crystarium grid, and you expand it using Christogen points earned from battle. You unlock stat boosts, passive skills, and new abilities by filling in glowing nodes like you're assembling IKEA furniture in the dark. Monsters, of course, level up using a different system entirely, requiring specific drop items from defeated enemies, because clearly having a universal leveling system would have been far too convenient. In summary, 13-2's combat system is as shiny and theatrical as ever, but it's also been laced with enough extraneous mechanics, fiddly subsystems, and Pokemon-like gimmicks to make even veteran RPG fans weep into their paradigm deck. It's not that it's bad, it's just over-designed to the point of parody, like someone kept adding ideas to the whiteboard until it collapsed under its own weight. But hey, at least you don't have to level up Lightning this time. Now look, I think we both know that talking about Final Fantasy XIII-2 without eventually addressing its ending would be like trying to review Titanic and politely avoiding the bit with the iceberg. It's unavoidable, it's pivotal, and in my opinion, utterly ridiculous. So consider this your official spoiler warning. If, for some reason, you've made it this far through time travel, chocobos and paradigm shifts without finishing the original Final Fantasy XIII-2. And if you'd like to reserve that final cutscene like a crystal in a cocoon, now might be the time to pause the video, sprint through 40 hours of paradoxes, and come back once you've reached the inevitable, yet infuriating conclusion. We get a cutscene so soul-crushingly bleak, so pointlessly nihilistic, that it makes the grim ending of the original 13 look like a Disney Channel wrap-up. After hours of being told that saving Lightning will fix everything, after watching Sarah fight across multiple centuries alongside a boy from the end of the world, the final twist is this, you foul. And I'm not even joking, I am being deadly serious. This isn't some metaphorical loss or a bittersweet sacrifice, no, you straight up lose. The timeline collapses, Sarah drops dead, Caius gets everything he wants, and the screen cuts to black, like you've just been mugged by the narrative. This is honestly not satire. This is the ending they rewarded us with after 40 hours of enduring the game. But worst of all, the title provided us with one final nugget of disappointment. A screen that says, to be continued. Not the end, not even thanks for playing, just a smug little tease as if players should be excited that everything they just accomplished was utterly meaningless and that the real story, whatever that might be, is being reserved for yet another sequel. Experiencing this ending on release filled me up with utter rage. It's the kind of conclusion that feels less like a cliffhanger and more like a publisher's ransom note. a narrative bait and switch where the heroes don't win, and your pat on the back for 40 hours of paradox correction is emotional devastation followed by a cold silence. And what makes it worse, so much worse, is how gleefully it spits in the face of Final Fantasy XIII's resolution. That game may have had its flaws, but at least it ended with sacrifice, closure, and some semblance of hope. 13-2 tears all of that down just to set up another sequel, one that, as we all know, only doubles down on the absurdity further. Dressed up in time travel gibberish and passed off as profundity. And in hindsight, Final Fantasy XIII-2 might be the moment the entire Fabula Nova Crystallis project stopped pretending it had a plan and started openly winging it. Aside from the fact that 13-2's existence is pure undiluted narrative sabotage, is that at the time of release we had no idea it didn't actually have an ending. There was no disclaimer, no to be continued warning on the box, no polite suggestion that we might be paying full price for part of a story, and yet that's exactly what we got. We were given no warning, and the game sold over 500,000 copies in its first week alone in Japan, and over 3 million worldwide, all while critics sang its praises, marvelling at its visual polish and praising the gameplay improvements, completely unaware that the final scene would pull the rug out from under them like a cruel joke. It wasn't marketed as part 2 of a trilogy, it was sold as a complete experience, but what players actually received was a cliffhanger so abrupt and so unapologetically hollow that it might as well have come with a coupon for the sequel. In hindsight, it's hard not to feel like we were tricked, not just by the developers, but by every glowing preview and early review that failed to mention the simple, brutal truth. This game doesn't end, it just stops. What makes all of this even more infuriating is the fact that Square Enix clearly knew Final Fantasy XIII-2 didn't have an ending, and didn't want to admit it until they'd squeezed every last skill from players first. Hints of a sequel were actually floating around as early as December 2011, when the domain for Final Fantasy XIII-3 was quietly registered. At the time, Square claimed that it was just a precaution. You know, in the same way that carving to be continued into the final cutscene was just a bit of cheeky artistic ambiguity. And when fans understandably asked why the story they just finished had no resolution, Square's response was to suggest we should all go and explore the alternate endings and download the DLC. That's right, the cliffhanger wasn't unfinished storytelling, it was apparently a feature. And then after releasing what they boldly called the final DLC, they turned around and announced more Final Fantasy XIII content anyway. So be sure to subscribe to join me in a few weeks when we cover the final chapter in the 13 trilogy. While 13-2 is in many ways ridiculous, thankfully Expedition 33, a modern turn-based gem, proves stylish combat and smart storytelling can coexist without drowning in pseudo-philosophical nonsense. Best of all, you can use my link to get a ludicrous 41% off this breakout hit, as well as save huge money off of thousands of other games, including practically every Final Fantasy game ever released. So, happy shopping and cheerio.